Well, good afternoon, folks. I am Joe Wheeler, the chair of the IJIS Court Advisory Committee, and I am pleased to have the opportunity to host the session this afternoon. This is another one of those IJIS virtual summit sessions where it's opportunities for industry and practitioners to get together and share ideas, have a discussion about what's going on about a specific topic. This topic, which is supported by efforts done by the Joint Technology Committee of COSCA and NACOM, the IJIS Security Task Force, and the IJIS Court Advisory Committee, is around cybersecurity. So I want to welcome everyone to this session here this afternoon. It is, cybersecurity in the courts. Ask the experts. We've got a fine panel of experts here with us this afternoon, as we did this morning. It's part of that summit series. And in these summits, we try to attack IT issues facing the courts in an open dialogue. So as if you were on this morning's call, you get to see it gets kind of spicy conversation, which is great. We will have lots of insights, lots of opinions, lots of approaches to how to handle the day-to-day problems of managing information technology. We're trying to encourage everybody to fully engage in this and take a variety of perspectives on this. In this afternoon session, it follows on, first of all, it follows on the 4 sessions that Kevin talked about this morning that JTC put on, the webinars that they put on. Tales from the cyber front line, lessons lived from lived experiences, cybersecurity basics, cyber insurance, and should we pay that ransom? And what's in your cyber coop? So those webinars were recorded. The links are available in the materials that, and their related materials will be made available to you as a result of this. They're available through the National Center for State Courts site, the JTC subsite of that. This session is also derivative of this morning's session. And so there's some topics that, as we take a look in the afternoon, we're going to probably follow up on, like things like zero trust and things like how do you hold your vendors accountable, those types of things. So we'll talk about some of those things as well and kind of lean in on what we heard this morning. As we put this session together, at least my perspective has been that that the courts have to knit together a variety of technologies to support their operations. From doing that, it's pretty clear, and from the session this morning, it's pretty clear that cybersecurity is a team sport. It involves people in your community that you're working with, your city or county providers, maybe state level providers, executive branch providers, but also folks from industry, such as the folks that are on this panel today. So we've brought together kind of a cross-section this afternoon of folks that a CIO or a court administrator might employ as he or she is pulling together their technology and securing that technology. We've got a hyperscalable cloud service provider. We've got application provider. We've got a cyber security service provider, and also a cybercrime information and support clearinghouse service provider. And so that panel includes a number of fine folks. One of the things for this afternoon's panel, you may have been expecting, based upon the information that went out previously, AWS to be here. Unfortunately, they weren't able to attend because of client matters that came up just this morning. So Dean is jumping in the breach and is helping us out again from Microsoft. And Dean is Director of Secure Enterprise at Microsoft. Dean, I'll let you introduce yourself and give a short background on what you bring to bear to the topic.
Sure. So I am a 20-year Microsoft employees. 17 of those have been spent working exclusively with state and local customers in a number of different capacities. So I was the first chief security advisor for Microsoft State and Local. I then started up the Office 365 team that came to talk to you about that when that product came out. And then back to managing a team, a national team of cybersecurity technical specialists, still all focused on state and local government, across Azure security workloads and across sort of M365 security workloads. And that's me.
Joe, we can't hear you, but
It was a really great introduction. I just couldn't repeat it again. No, Paul, thank you. Paul comes from Thomson Reuters, Technology Operations Manager. Paul, why don't you give us some of your background?
hi, good afternoon, everyone. Name's Paul Spinks. I'm from Thomson Reuters. I'm a technology operations manager for Thomson Reuters, working in our case center product line. It's a product that is used in courthouses. We sell it in various countries across the world, to governments, to courtrooms and courthouses, etc., for presentation and preparation of court material. I'm sort of here today. I can kind of provide a couple of different perspectives, both as a cloud service provider that's providing an application that we aim to sell and provide for use in the courtroom. But I'm also a user of cloud services from a hyperscale cloud provider. We're quite open about the fact that we host all of our cloud center, our case center operations on the Microsoft Azure cloud. And so I've got quite a bit of experience in using these cloud platforms for providing services, depending on what you're looking to do, whether it's by software as a service or move infrastructure you've already got into cloud. Before coming to Thomson Reuters, I've got about 18 years experience in working in government IT. I spent most of that on the other side of this fence, rather than working on supply side. I was in government side, assisting with the procurement and running of systems in a kind of government space.
Very good.
Jason, over to you next.
Yeah.
Hey, Jason Franks. I'm a cybersecurity analyst with Mission Critical Partners. I've been here for about a year. Before that, the previous 29 years, the majority of that was spent in the DoD world, in IT and communications and cybersecurity specialties, different roles. Some of them getting to do fun things and go deploy to some of those really nice vacation hotspots that we all like so much over in the Middle East. For the past year, like I said, I've been with being with Mission Critical Partners, where we specialize with in the courts, the public safety, and the whole law enforcement ecosystem, if you will. I'm just happy to be here.
Thank you, Jason. And Stacy. Stacy, you're with Cybercrime Support Network. You're Vice President of Resiliency Services. How about some of your background?
Thanks. Hi, everybody. So I have been in the business of cyber and IT for a little over 20 years at this point. Unlike some of these folks, and like some of them, I actually come from a background where I worked state and local government for years before I joined the FBI. Joined the FBI, worked as a cyber intel analyst, and then moved over to a little organization called the Center for Internet Security and MSISAC. I know both got raised this morning, so fairly well known in the business. I got to build their intel team. And now I'm here at CSN creating something called the cyber domain for the National Information Exchange Model, or NIEM. basically a way that SLTT governments can share information back and forth about cyber incidents, regardless of whether they use different terms or anything else like that. So that's my background. Looking forward to talking to you. I definitely have a bias towards intel sharing and law enforcement, though.
Thank you, Stacy. You mentioned SOTT.
Yeah, SLTT, state, local, tribal, territorial.
Terrific. Thank you. I'll try to slow the acronyms down when I get snowed, at least. We'll get that worked out. From this morning's, well, first of all, just some groundwork. If you folks have a question or anything like that, I encourage you to put it in the chat. Alex and I will be trying to keep track of that and make sure that those all come to play here. Everybody on this call, this is a Zoom meeting, not a Zoom webinar. You all have a seat at the table. So if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll get you connected with folks and can be part of the conversation with the panelists or with other folks that are on the call as well. And I encourage you to drop questions or insights into the chat. From this morning's call, one of the things that came up was really the framework. It's kind of the framework that a consultant like I run into all the time, where courts have brought to bear their own applications they may host in the court. They may be connected to the state or executive branch data center and have resources there. They may be leaning on resources like Thomson Reuters software as a service resources that are based on the Azure platform. Looking at all that, where does a court administrator or a court CIO really begin to get their arms around cybersecurity and all that? I'll leave it up to anybody out there. Maybe Stacy, you got a hot mic. Let's start with you.
I think that's a good thing. Okay. So I'm a huge believer in sharing intelligence. And to me, that is one of the best ways to get started, is to look for information that's already shared. It's not necessarily just meaning the tactical information like IP addresses. A lot of the times, the best place to get started is something like the NIST cybersecurity framework, the CIS controls, ISO 27001. These are all documents that a lot of people, most of them smarter than I am, have worked on together, pulled together their best advice. So it's a starting point. CISA Cyber Essentials is also another great one. The trick to getting started, at least for me, is that you're not trying to take on the world all at once. You have to start simple. And I know this one's going to come up later too, I'm sure, but start with knowing what's actually out there. You got to know what you're protecting and what matters the most. So the devices, what's on the network, what your employees and bosses care about the most, and how they all work together. You need that network map before you can go any further.
Very good.
Yeah. Hey, Joe. Yeah, I think Stacy's right on. It's key to have the information. You need to have information right at your fingertips. And just to kind of amplify what she's saying is I think getting an assessment is mandatory. It's really key. It's kind of like Google Maps, right? Let's say I want to go to Hoover Dam. All right, so I pull out my computer, I go to Google Maps, I type in Hoover Dam. What's the first thing it needs from me? It says, well, I need to know where you're at, or I can't give you any directions. It's the same thing for cybersecurity. How do I know where I'm going unless I know where I'm at?
Very good.
I also think that sometimes obvious things are just kind of staring you in the face, just the very basic things that that you would do perhaps in your own personal life, like making sure that you're at least running on operating systems that are still supported. When we talk about people starting from the very beginning, it could be the case that there's been that, you know, systems have just been left to stagnate over a number of years through the lack of investment. And actually, just some of the basics, like, yes, we've got a VPN, but, you know, nobody's updating it. Yes, we're running operating systems, but nobody's patching them. And these are the ways, these are some of the really basic ways that you get exploited, because often it's not necessarily a targeted exploit. There's just systems out on the web scanning for people that haven't updated, poking at holes that have been known about for years that outdated software still has. So as well, I completely agree with the other speakers, but I'd also just say some of the things are just really kind of elementary, and their advice that's been pushed at us for years in our personal lives, and we need to make sure that the work system, you know, systems we have at work are maintained to at least that standard.
So I couldn't agree more with Stacey's notion of information sharing. There's one specific interesting example, I think it's interesting, that Microsoft has been working on for a long time, and it's something we call the intelligent security graph, which basically, obviously Microsoft runs a bunch of massive cloud services, M365, Azure, et cetera. And not surprisingly, and, you know, Outlook Online and Exchange Online, et cetera. And not surprisingly, we collect a massive amount of really interesting threat intel / telemetry from those services. I'm talking to the tune of 24 trillion with a T feeds a day. You want to talk about a big database, yeah. And that's not the interesting part. I mean, it's moderately interesting, but what's interesting is about in 2018, I think we actually. So I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that the cybersecurity industry does not have a great track record on alliances and collaborations between different vendors. It's a massively fragmented industry. And, you know, there's a lot of, and I don't say this to be mean, but there's a lot of organizations that are really good at one thing, right? And that's why you end up having to buy 20 to 30 things to secure your environment, right? Which creates complexity and all that kind of stuff. But more importantly, what we found was because of this massive threat intelligence database that we kind of inherited just by running these services, we started a partner association back in 2018 with like 18 partners, some of whom, and today it's grown to about 300 and something, all plugging into various parts of the platform that we've been building, but primarily that giant threat intelligence brain in the cloud called the ISG, because even our competitors see that everybody collaborating and sharing threat data makes everybody smarter, right? Also creates an ecosystem, which is also, even being charitable, not something that's really existed much in the cyber industry historically, because everybody is very protective of their IP. And so it didn't happen. I'm hoping maybe this will be a good working alliance between a lot of folks that normally would compete against each other, but realize that we have common enemies, and we need to share data in order to overcome that and level the playing field.
You know, so you talk about, you use the term trillion, and Stacey, you had a variety of resources that you identified. And I'm sitting here thinking, as either a IT manager for a court or a court administrator, you know, where do I begin with the, you know, how do I invest my time with all the variety of resources? Is there a way to break it down into something I can consume in the time I have to invest on IT thinking about it? Or do I get an information security officer of some sort? Or, you know, do you guys have any advice on how to start to tackle that as you scale from small to larger organizations there? Any way to address this, all the information that's in it, consume it and do something actionable with it?
Apparently, I'm the only one who wants to go first. I will start by saying you don't necessarily have to consume all the information out there. There are entities that will do it for you. Groups like CISA and MS-ISAC and all the other ISACs and ISAOs Within each state government, there are fusion centers that all work cyber to varying degrees. There are a lot of entities out there now that will help you take that information, that intelligence, and pull out the pieces that are particularly relevant to your situation, whatever it may be. So if you start with one of these basic frameworks or standards, make sure you know what you've got and how you're going, or what matters most. So the data that matters most that you really want to protect. And then you can start looking at the current threats that somebody else is going to, in a sense, feed you on a silver platter, because they're going to tailor it to what you need. Some of those resources cost money. Some of them are free, but there are other ways you can incorporate resources like that. So you can take things like Quad 9, which is a DNS service. It protects your computer from reaching out to known bad DNS IPs. You don't actually have to understand the IPs or anything like that. Quad 9 is a free service. So you can incorporate a lot of these services without consuming the intelligence yourself. You just have to be able to put in place a little piece here, a little piece there, and follow some of the guidelines that are already created in what order to do that. Joe, you're back on mute.
How about now? Sorry, any other guidance on how to get organized on this? I know that JTC put a cyber basics paper together that Roger.
You're on mute.
Here, I'll just do that. Never trust a consultant, IT consultant that can't work technology. As I was saying, are there other insights on how to get to basically get down to the things that are most important? Maybe conversations with your CIO, taking advantage of cyber basics. Dean, any suggestions?
Yeah, I alluded to this morning, and the conclusion that I've come to after years and years of conversations on this topic with customers and seeing the incredible shortage of resources that they have, the great thing about standards around security is that they are comprehensive. In my opinion, though, there's a downside, which is that says, well, you've got to do all of it, as if all of them are equally important, right? And I don't know that those standards do as good of a job of telling you how to prioritize what's in there. And when you don't have the bodies to deploy any new security capabilities, that becomes a guns or butter kind of dilemma. And so I have started talking to customers. Again, I said this morning. I know there's people on the call that were there. I'm just going to say that if we're looking at ways to prioritize when we can't do everything and the 80-20 rule still applies, lead with automation. Things that will help you get automated, because you're not getting any more bodies to throw at this problem. So you have to find ways to automate the low-level stuff, get your people working on more meaningful security tasks, tier 2, tier 3 SOC analysts, if you have a SOC, that kind of thing. By the way, that's also a talent retention benefit if you make their work more meaningful and get them out of the crappy tier 1 SOC analyst life, which is a horrible, soul-crushing life. And so I would say, there's lots of ways you can sort the list, but I would say automation for state and local governments is would be a pretty game-changing one, because it's easy to get inside cybersecurity, especially around standards. It's easy to get analysis paralysis, which I think your opening question sort of points to. And to me, automation is one of the ways that we improve our outcomes with the resources we have.
I won't disagree. But I would point back, like you said, to the first question, the assessments. There are several free assessments out there, and now they are tailored so that if you get a low score in one section, it will point you at the resources you need, which ones to pick up, where to automate. So those CISA assessments, the MSISAC, there's a ton of assessments out there, and they will all get you to that whatever implementation for the automation that is most particular to your situation.
Yep. And we, in the Microsoft 365 world and Azure world, we have something called Secure Score that is in the spirit of that same thing. It doesn't just, and it actually goes beyond just what's a top priority, but it actually weighs how much work is this, and also how much impact to users, because that's not nothing. So yeah, we're definitely building out stuff like that. I just add the additional thing that, if we should have in our Secure Score, what lets me automate. So I'm parroting that, and I'll stop now on that front. But yeah, there are definitely tools out there to do that. I think the standards themselves don't. So if you go through an assessment, sure, but the having something like a Secure Score to give you direction, whatever that prioritization criteria is definitely useful.
And I'd just sort of add to what both Stacey and Dean said, and try and say, make sure that when you're looking at these standards, you're spread across the different controls. What I see quite a lot is, absolutely comprehensive coverage in one area and absolutely nothing in another area. You'd be best pooling your resources more thinly across all the controls and making sure you've got some coverage in all of the areas or most of the areas. And that's going to give you an overall more protection. And we see that as a supplier as well in the questions we get asked by customers when they're looking to buy from us. We'll get a whole load of security questions on one really narrow area that dives way beyond anything we've ever seen before. And then there'll be whole other sections where it's not even been touched upon. And I think that becomes quite a common issue, and conversations go really deep down rabbit holes. So it's always worth just keeping it up, making sure you've got a spread across.
Geofencing.
So I'd like to bring it back just a little bit to the original point, because we've hit on the assessments, and I think that's key to understanding where you're at. But during that assessment process, one of the key tasks you're talking about doing is you're positively identifying every single thing that's on your network, which what Stacey brought up too. And to go back to Joe's question is, like, if I'm getting an influx of information from all these different intel sources, how do I make sense of what? Right? Well, if you've identified everything on your network, and by knowing what systems you have, you will start to be able to weed out certain things. For instance, an alert comes in and says, oh, there's a major flaw with Confluence, and it's got a criticality score of 9.3. Oh my God, what am I supposed to do? So instead of scrambling for it, if you know your environment, you don't have to really worry about that one, and you can just kind of move on, feeling confident that you're not just sticking your head in the sand.
When you say you don't have to worry about it, what goes into that equation there? Why does a court not have to worry about Confluence?
Well, where I was getting at is if you've done your diligence and you've done the complete identification of your network, you understand that Confluence is not within your environment, so you don't need to worry about it.
Okay.
A very quick anecdote. I cannot stress, as the other speakers have, the inventory process. I mean, you can't manage what you can't see, and you can't secure what you can't manage. And I have sat in on some very uncomfortable security audits with some major cities in state and local government, where they found literally 3,000 undocumented devices on their network. They basically found another network on their network. How can you ever hope of securing your environment if you have that kind of gap between the known and the unknown? It's just untenable.
Yeah, and Jason, Paul, you hit on something that comes near and dear to me. I've been subject to write a ton of specs, and when you look at the specifications for security for a case management system or something like that, what really is the approach to take on that? We heard about nimble contracts. RFPs are the beginning of a contract, what makes up, from our nimble contract discussion this morning, what should be in an RFP about security? And this can be open to Paul or anybody else here.
Well, I mean, as I say, my main thing would make sure that you've got, repeating my previous point, make sure you've got an even spread of questions. You don't just have a pile of security questions that all focus on one thing. And that's relatively easy to do, as I think Stacey said. All of these standards are on all their controls are all available for you to download and go and look through and pick through and decide what might be the most appropriate for your, to require for your organisation. The other thing, of course, is organisations are also independently getting themselves assessed by these standards bodies. We go out and we hold ourselves subject to third-party scrutiny with standards like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and most recently in the US FedRAMP. So the fact that a supplier can attest to having a current one of those certifications, and that's very important because most of them only last 12 months at most, it is also quite important, and that may mean you don't need to ask some of the questions that are perhaps not so important to you because you know that they will have been covered by that standard, and you can then focus your line of questioning on the things that are most important to you.
So lean on standards. Go ahead, Dean.
So I'm of the opinion, for one thing, if we agree, and the industry, not just me or what we're building in Microsoft, but the industry is moving towards more of a platform, more of an integrated approach to security, because the benefits of correlation and corresponding response are just significant. We're just looking to move the pendulum in another direction towards something more effective. But our procurement practices in state and local do not support that, I would say. I have seen RFPs as specific as just for MFA. Like we get pulled into an RFP to respond to something for just, one massively important, but really tightly scoped. It's basically some IT director gets $30,000 and that's the way the money's allocated. So there's no incentive in the way the procurement is structured to have a comprehensive view or approach of tackling the cybersecurity problem. Historically, that's what we've seen, and we get pulled into these. And I think it's going to be difficult to get to a new approach if procurement doesn't shift.
Okay, and you referenced MFA, multi-factor authentication, which is one.
Sorry, I should not be using the acronyms.
One important aspect, but key. So, as we go and write RFPs for case management systems or evidence management, those types of things, what sort of approach should we take? What should we be asking for, do you think? Adherence to the standard suite? Or do we ask for, I was talking about things about, say, annual reviews in your contracts, that you look at service level agreements and annual review of threats and services and those types of things.
Well, and security metrics, those, when the landscape the risk landscape or threat landscape starts to shift. We were talking about this morning. I sort of just typed into the chat that I thought that, it might be controversial with the vendor because it kind of leaves them open. It's kind of open-ended, but the ability to introduce or replace how we measure success, right? For, today it might be mean time to response, mean time to detection, but that might not be the best metric 2 years from now. I mean, who knows? As the threats shift, if your contract is locked into metrics from 3 years ago landscape, that might not be ideal.
So what if, Stacey, go ahead. You got a hot mic.
Yeah, so intel bias here. Look at the incidents that are actually happening to your peers. When you go to that conference and you talk to each other and you hear about something that has happened in lessons learned, don't be afraid to think about or even practice through a TTX tabletop exercise or something. what happens if that happened to you? Ask your vendors, if this was what was happening, how would you respond? Could you do this? Would it be covered? And so on. Use those real life examples, because that will also help make it relevant to the people in the room who are not cyber people.
Mm-hmm. That's good. That's good. You know, when you talk about those metrics, Dean, are there some basics that we could go find someplace that would be common metrics to start with?
I don't know if I could pick those out effectively for like a case management app specifically. I'm not that deep in the court's technology. But I would say, you know, if you're looking for like a managed, detection and response type service, which hopefully a lot of our customers are starting to kick the tires on more because of the resourcing challenge we've already talked about. You know, the basics like mean time to detection and mean time to response. And when you use those vendors, first thing they're going to do, even if they're using your stuff and managing your stuff, is they're going to look at how do I automate this stuff, right? Because they're profit and loss based, so they're looking to drive efficiency for the money they're charging you. And so they're going to, that's the first thing that they're going to start working on in your environment, if it's your environment. And so those are the two today, but I can't tell you what they might be in 2 years. Is you got to detect stuff sooner, and which means being able to correlate between different security workloads and their purpose-built detections and stuff like that, to correlate across and see not 4 separate alerts on 4 separate tools, but one incident that is going on, right? I call it 3 yellows instead. Sorry, I call it 1 red instead of 3 yellows. Right, that's a valuable form of analysis that you don't have access to if one tool can't talk to another. So, so it takes you longer to recreate the event timeline, figure out what's going on, so that increases your MTDD, MTDR. So again, that's that's where I would start.
Paul, you know, we talk about these application solution providers like yourselves, and how do you see your role in this? This is probably an investment as you maintain that service. Do you commonly get asked to do this type of thing? And if asked, is it additional service, additional cost? How does that work?
We don't get asked to do it as often as we probably should. We do use automated tools to perform the processes that Dean as described, some of them provided by his company, some of them provided by other third parties. And I think the key thing here is integration into that automation. So, you know, we have across our different cloud platforms, we have data going into a single place. We have an IT security operations team who then oversee that. We have automated tools which will automatically monitor for unusual activity, as well as doing posture assessment, which is more just looking to make sure that you've configured things properly, which is way easier to do in the cloud, by the way, than it was on-prem, when you had all these different pieces of software of different dates. It's much easier for a system to go, you haven't set TLS 1.2 on your application gateway, than it was for it to trawl around the network trying to find if you actually had any gateways. You know, that's what we have, and we operate behind the scenes to try and protect our customers. In terms of sort of notifying customers, we, you know, for all of our customer relationships, as part of the onboarding process, we will have a number of named contacts at the customer, for which we would supply this information if we thought that there had been an incident that needed to be notified. And sometimes you may actually need the customer's input to help understand something. You know, we've had a situation not that long ago where we thought we were seeing unusual activity on our platform, and actually it was because they'd sent out a notification once we contacted the customer and said, we have seen this and we are investigating it. And they said, oh, well, that's probably because we've sent out this notification telling everybody to update all of their cases today in preparation for return to in-person hearings. And that had caused all of our normal parameters. I mean, if anybody's ever sort of watched one of these systems, the same peaks and troughs are happening every day, and the system hums along in a kind of fairly steady state. And then everything sort of goes a little bit different today. And so, actually, as I say, that wasn't, well, it was unusual activity, but it wasn't a threat. That was just tripped our alarms because it wasn't what the system would normally see happening in a typical day.
It seems like a lot of moving parts to manage. When you start to think about, you've got evidence management for your specific application. You might have a journal or Equivant with case management, a jury management system, an e-filing system from somebody else. That whole management of all the providers in this environment. Any tips from anybody here in terms of trying to take care of that management across all the providers? That vendor management side of things, any insight?
So one thing that I've seen that I always seem to bring up is when you start talking about the management or the support side of that, right? That life cycle, if you will, is I want to know whoever's on your support team that's supporting the software that I have now. Does everybody have their own unique logon ID, right? Please tell me you're not using a group account where I've got 7 people all logging in with the same credentials. And then please don't tell me that you're probably, if you're doing that, there's a good chance you're probably using the same username password for other systems, for other customers, right? So, I mean, if that, potentially if those credentials get exposed, then that's going to mean all of the systems that are being supported by that vendor are exposed.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. So, one of the things that this brings in is the sharing of information. And Stacy, you mentioned National Information Exchange Model, or NIEM, and a framework that you're working on there. That kind of caught my interest. How does that impact information sharing, like warrants coming in and coming out of a court, getting confirmed, coming back, citations coming in, all those types of things? Where does your work come into play there?
So let me start by explaining NIEM for those who haven't heard of it before. NIEM actually has been around for about 20 years at this point. It was put together by the US government. It's now going international in scope and becoming part of IJIS. So it really is a recognized method of exchanging data. It's not a standard like we've been talking about. Instead, it's a vocabulary. So Joe, if I want to share information with you and we wanted to automate it like Dean's been talking about, I would have to map my system to your system, right? And I would have to make sure that I knew if I said the word incident and you said the word breach, we're talking about the same thing. NIEM acts as a middle language. So I can map to NIEM, you can map to NIEM, but that way I don't have to map to everybody on this call and try and keep all of those up to date. So the whole idea here is that we're not talking just cyber, we are talking warrants, we're talking CJIS information, we're talking agricultural information and maritime and everything else that's out there. And then it's now integrating with cyber so we can report cyber incidents in the agricultural field and know that when we're talking about a worm, we're talking about something on a computer or the squiggly crawly thing that they're talking about in the ground. So that's where the advancements we're getting to are playing in the background a lot where we're not even seeing them. NIEM actually started with the justice domain. So courts have been involved in it from way back early 2000s. And it's probably operating on your network, even if you don't know that you are translating to NIEM.
Okay. I was just kind of curious as to how that goes. Sadly, I was kind of involved when NEAM was JGXDM. So I just dated myself massively there. But no, that's cool. Now, one of the things that has come up, and Shay just gave you kudos for the explanation of NEAM there. One of the things that's come up, Jason talked about identity in the morning session. Dean, you were saying identity is our firewall, I think, if I remember that correctly.
Your new perimeter.
Your new perimeter. I mean, so what does that mean? What does that mean for a CIO as she or he stands up applications for their courts?
Well, I would say that identity, in order to enable identity to work in a hybrid world, there has to be some footprint that is available outside your firewall, that is available, either synchronized or what have you, to a cloud service like Okta or Active Directory or Azure Active Directory, AAD. And that kind of enables new scenarios for when users are mobile, for when users are on other types of devices that you don't manage, that kind of thing. I mean, it's a linchpin of any kind of zero trust identity component is kind of cloud enabling your making your identity portable, because that's what you're going to use. One of the main things you're going to use to check, and provide access management is via the person's identity, hopefully strengthened with multi-factor authentication of some kind to give stronger validation of that authentication transaction, etc. And so, yeah, that's kind of where it starts, I think, is because it becomes the main check along with device health and other conditions. Now, let me say this: when I talk about multi-factor authentication, I am baking into my version of that something I would call, every vendor is going to call it something different. We call it conditional access, in the sense that if you just turn on MFA for every user in every scenario and every network, you're going to get your head handed to you. And so really what has to go hand in hand with that is situational awareness and the ability to risk assess every single authentication that is requested. So I want to check for device health. What is this device in another country, right? Is this authentication happening 2 minutes after an authentication from the same user from Beijing? You know what I mean? Impossible travel scenarios, all kinds of, and you get to configure what those are. But at the end, nobody gets authenticated until you have strong authentication, you have situational knowledge of the device that's being used, as well as the identity. Is that identity showing up on the dark web for sale, right? That would certainly flag that. All these different checks for health of the identity and the device become essential parts of whether, and based on your risk score, you assign different responses. If I'm on a managed network, right, that I trust, my internal network, and the user authenticates, they might never see an MFA challenge, right? But if they're outside my network, if they're on a questionable machine or any other of those red flag scenarios, I can either make them reset their password as the response, or I can challenge them with MFA, right? So if you don't have that kind of nuanced risk-based approach to each authentication, MFA fails as a project because users will not adopt it, or they will complain so loudly that you will turn it off.
Because the overhead's too high. It's a pain in the tush.
Yeah, not worth it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you talk about identity, you mentioned Azure AD, and you mentioned Okta, which is a service that's outside of the courts directory. So if a court's stood up Active Directory or directory of users internally, that's different than what you're talking about here, right?
Well, Okta can function as a central identity store. I would say that's not typically how they get introduced. They're usually introduced with a specific application, like a citizen services application. That's usually how Okta is first introduced in an environment. But yeah, I mean, they can function as your central identity store from the cloud, just like Active Directory does. And they have different features, and you got to compare and stuff, and depending on what apps you're trying to enable or whatever. But That's what I meant by Okta, is they can function as another. Every time I answer a question, I'm trying to give you a multi-vendor answer.
Good for you.
And so they definitely have that as an offering. They can help enable a zero trust strategy by being that identity store in the cloud that works anywhere in the world because of the internet.
Yeah. Paul, how does this impact you?
Well, I was going to say first is the way I've kind of always visualized this is the way that we used to do things is we would throw a ring of steel in the form of a firewall, and then we'd host a load of unsecure services inside that network. And that's where this phrase zero trust that we'll probably touch on next comes from, because those services just trusted that everything was good in those networks. I want to talk to you. Yeah, come on in. We're in the ring of steel. Everything's good. And sometimes that ring of steel was so severe, we literally unplugged it from the internet. And it was isolated to just an office or a local district, or we ran it across a public leased line. And that was what government IT looked like when I started and some of that's still there. But the problem is that doesn't deliver the user experiences that we need to deliver nowadays. You can't run a service and not connect to the internet if you want to run a digital services and engage with your user base. The other thing is there's actually a real security risk to that, which is if someone penetrates that ring, they get access to everything. So what you start now starting to see is what I would put on what some call self-secured services. So each service that you operate is in itself secured. It doesn't rely on some external security service to secure it. It is capable of itself of sitting on the internet and using an identity service like Dean's described to authenticate people to come to use it. So if you think of our product, we don't rely on any security existing really, other than the user using a modern browser, which we would always recommend. We don't rely on their network security or other things to consume our service. That service is self-secure. But where this identity piece comes in is you don't want a separate username and password for every system, because that causes a whole bunch of security concerns. That is an absolute pain for the users, especially if you then try and put MFA over the top and they've got like 15 apps on their phone, and they've either got 15 apps on their phone, or literally every 5 minutes they're getting a text message they have to type into the system. So if you have a common identity service, then all of the services, the self-secure services that you run, can use that identity service to provide the authentication. And that identity service can do really sophisticated things, like Dean's just described, that us as a self-secured service, we don't have to worry about. If Azure Directory says this is okay, this is okay. They've done it's done the checks, it's complied with corporate policy. And there's some real practical benefits as well, just for things like joiners and leavers. If you have 15 user accounts in 15 separate systems, when the person leaves, invariably they are not removed from all those systems. Whereas if you have a common identity model, that person leaves. In the case of TR, it's actually connected to our HR system. So as soon as their contract expires, their account is disabled, and their access to all of those somewhat independent systems operated by different vendors ceases because their identity is disabled. So I think that's what it means overall. And for us, it means we can offer a service that people can log into using the identities they already had, which is a big win for the user and the usability of the system.
It sounds huge. I think, Dean, you said nobody wants to maintain a whole variety of user accounts, much like Paul just described. It's a administrative nightmare to do all that. So being
especially for partners, right? You don't want to host other organizations. It's not a best practice to create new accounts in your environment so people from partner organizations can log in and access resources. There are better ways to do that today. B2B, if it's a citizen, and B2C type offerings are much more efficient in doing that, and less risky. You're not bringing them wholesale in, guests into your environment, into your identity store.
So is this all part of that zero trust thing that you were talking about?
Yeah, definitely. Zero trust, it touches on a lot of different stuff because it's really about securing all the things, with the key risk areas that we see being devices and people, right? Typically, a user clicks on something dumb on a device, and that becomes the battleground, the initial battleground for what may become a breach down the road, right? Once they get access to an account, then they can start sniffing around on your internal network to find a better account that has more privileges, like a help desk account or what have you. And so it's about, once you get in, it's about lateral movement and privilege escalations, what we call it. And there are tools that help you do that. It's not that complicated. You just got to trick somebody into logging into a particular box that you control. So, and back to what Paul was saying earlier, when you cease to believe that your internal network is trusted, what you're essentially saying is something I mentioned this morning, which is one of the principles of zero trust in most zero trust models that vendors have, is assume breach, right? So I don't need, it's not the iron wall that's protecting me anymore. It's those more localized, like it's like a bunch of castles within a castle, right? In the sense that each component, each asset has to be part of an architecture that can defend itself, right? From attacks, even from within, because a lot of the worst attacks that we see are what we call trusted user phishing, where somebody clicks on an external email, gets their account compromised, and then that account starts sending phishing emails internally to other internal accounts, especially people that the person emails with all the time, because they're 100% going to click on that, right? And so once they're in your network, you got to have a mechanism to deal with that, right? So if your phishing tool only operates at your firewall and doesn't control it, doesn't work on internal communications, you got to get a new tool, because once they get in, there are lots of opportunities to move around.
Yep.
If you're actually building cloud services on the modern cloud platforms, these things aren't hard to achieve. In fact, they're hard not to achieve. The cloud platforms now push you down this route. We build our services on platform services. We try and avoid all the virtual infrastructure as possible at every turn. That's not necessarily true across all of our organization, but within our project, that is the way that we operate. It will be an absolute last resort before we spin up a virtual machine with an actual operating system on it and start installing software. And so if you start building on these platform services like SQL databases as a platform service, web hosting as a platform service, there's zero trust by default. You can't, if you create a storage bucket, it won't let you access it without the key, and it'll default to HTTPS for a start. So, and you have to actively go out of your way to weaken that. Now, that doesn't mean that lazy developers who have not got proper oversight won't weaken that to make their life easier. And that's why things like posture assessment and policy application at the organization level are very important when using a cloud service, because whilst those guide rails are there, there's always going to be somebody who's having a lazy day that decides to push one of them over. So you need to, make sure that you, have good corporate policies in place. What I'm saying is the things that we're describing here when building in a cloud environment are not something you have to go out and seek. They're kind of there natively in the way these services are built.
Yeah, and there's like in Azure, for example, I won't speak to any other vendors' capabilities in terms of hosting, but for example, it's a lot easier in a cloud forward environment where most of your computing assets are in the cloud to do things like apply security baselines to, consistently across all the assets that you have. That's just easier in the cloud. Paul's absolutely correct that zero trust is easier to get to when your footprint's primarily in the cloud. It gets way more complicated when you're doing a hybrid cloud version of that and trying to secure a bunch of on-prem stuff, partly because of back to the inventory thing that that we were talking about, that, you know, there's a lot of stuff that's undocumented still on private networks that are definitely become a risk.
So, you know, we talked about the initial assessment in the private networks and being able to find the assets, start to secure those assets. Stacy, I saw you drop into the chat a drive towards getting to zero trust. Is there any insights folks can have for progression for, as Jason says, you are here in Google Maps to where you want to go, how to start to walk that through? Is that something that you get services for? Is that something that there's a progression for?
Every vendor has a zero trust assessment tool. Now, what I'll say about zero trust, it's every vendor defines it differently, which is, I'm sure, a massive source of frustration for customers. But for how they scope it, they will have an assessment tool. They'll help you prioritize. You know, there's a lot of parts to zero trust, but they can help you prioritize with the stuff that they offer in a zero trust vein. That's what I would say.
Cool. Any
I'm
other?
going to throw in non-vendor specific. The link I posted to CISA, they are actually in charge of it for the federal government, for the civilian agencies. So they have a huge collection of resources. There's a maturity model, there's a resource hub, there's all kinds of things you can go to that are less vendor specific. Now they are tailored mostly for the federal agencies, but in a lot of cases that carries across to state and locals as well.
Oh, all right. Any other insights on how to get there?
I think there's also, I think all the cloud providers offer well-architected review processes where, you know, the vendors have provided for their platform a questionnaire that you can go through to make sure you've kind of covered most of the things off. We use it, we have to use it as part of our kind of sign-off process before a service is allowed to go live. But you don't need to write your own, and you don't need to make it up, because a bit like with the standards, there's a whole load of stuff out there for free. And I would recommend using the one, if you're building on cloud, using the one for the cloud provider that you're building on.
Okay. And is this something accessible to just anybody? Court administrator can work this? Anybody,
yeah. I mean, if you just, I mean, I'm only personally familiar with working on the Azure platform, so I'm going to keep coming back to that. But for that, you know, you can just go on site, search well-architected review, start a new review, and start filling out the questionnaire. I should imagine for AWS, Google, exactly the same thing. And it's a little bit better if you do it for the one for using the cloud provider you're building on, if you are indeed building on a cloud provider, just because it's going to use the right terminology for that platform. Where, you know, it's exactly the same thing on two platforms and have a totally different name, and then it's not, you know, entirely obvious.
And most of the time, the vendor, I can't speak for all the assessment tools out there, are trying the best to map the capabilities that they offer to like the federal standard. It depends like what it is you're assessing, but I know Microsoft works very closely with NIST in a lot of capacities around coming up with Azure security baselines and things like that. And same thing with zero trust, is as much as there's a standard for that that you can point to, we're going to try to map to that, and even, you know, try to gamify it some and make it a score. Right, you know, give you a prioritized list, and so that, you know, if you do number 1, it'll improve your score by 50 points. If you do number 7 first, it'll only improve your score by 4 points. You know what I mean? So you have some kind of a directional baseline for how to prioritize your tasks or your punch list.
Mm-hmm. So as we talk,
what I would like to just add on, this might be my controversial comment of the session, and that is, you do have to look at some of these things carefully, though, because there is definitely, in my opinion, sometimes the vendor is trying to push you towards their services. in some of these reviews. And the same can go for some of these things like Security Center and other things. It's definitely wanting you to use the cloud provider services. And some of the things people will often say at the beginning, I want to get 100%. I don't want to add in any exceptions to the tool. You've got to comply with everything. Well, that's actually impossible, because sometimes there are mutually exclusive things that the tool says you have to do. And you've got to pick one and you can't pick the other. So, because they're mutually exclusive, and the tool won't tell you that. So you do need to sort of, it's not as simple as just go through and go, I'm going to fill this in, I'm going to tick every box, I'm going to put every piece of security on. Some of those pieces of security are going to cost you a lot more money. Some are going to add a lot more value than others, and some are actually mutually exclusive. So you do need to have an open process. We have a process here whereby, you know, I can't imagine there are any services that don't have at least one exception. The process isn't you mustn't have any exceptions. The process is, why have you got some exceptions? Let's go through the list of exceptions you've got, work out whether any are just because you haven't done it correctly, or whether there are good justifications for some of them, which they're normally always, well, I like to make sure there always are before I actually get in front of whoever's assessing it. But that's worth bearing in mind.
So Jim Price from Arizona asks a question in this space. Based upon the bidirectional zero trust conversation we're having here, what resources are available to enterprise users, including password managers, that can be used, excuse me, used to ensure they're accessing and logging into legitimate enterprise approved systems and services? Any insights from that perspective?
That sounds like something that would be handled by a cloud app security broker tool. Basically, inventories shadow IT that's coming through your environment, and then assigns it a risk score. And then what you can do, because the scary part of shadow IT is people using their Yahoo accounts to log into services and then dropping documents from your enterprise environment onto there. What's even more scary is them using a copied version of their enterprise credentials to log into a third party's consumer service. You know what I mean? Just so they don't have to remember another password. They use their domain password, manually input into a, some Dropbox or what have you that's on their consumer account. That's the nightmare scenarios. And CASBs are there to inventory those things, assign them risk based on a bunch of different criteria, and then start enforcing log in just with only with federated people, only with SaaS tools that I'm federated with. So I'm using my enterprise credentials, but it's a formal, federated relationship that is vetted, et cetera, as opposed to just manually copying the credentials over to that tool. I think that's what we're describing, right? Is trying to discover shadow IT and then get a better handle on it and block some and federate with others and force, normal federated credential use and block massive downloads of data to insecure platforms. Did I hear that right?
Jim, can you come on and help clarify the question? We'll give you a minute to unmute and join the conversation here. I wonder if you just draw.
There we
There
go.
he is.
I think I've clicked the right buttons.
Thank you, Jim.
You're welcome. So it's the responsibility of every employee in an organization to ensure that they're not clicking on the wrong documents, the wrong links, and so on. And so there's quite a bit of onus placed on individuals to know what to do, when to do it, etc. So the question is there anything from an enterprise perspective that's coming down the pike that is going to help in that regard? Shadow IT sounds ominous. So yeah, anything along those lines that are envisioned or being worked on that we can look forward to.
The MCAS thing is a piece of it, but when you're talking about sort of data exfiltration risk in general, like people dropping stuff in places, documents and stuff that into places they shouldn't be, like consumer tools or on a consumer device like their phone or whatever. So the other piece, I guess, that comes to mind is data loss prevention tools that can work in conjunction with a CASB solution to identify documents that have personal information, court data. It'll vary by department type, what they consider sensitive, PII, all that kind of stuff, and it's able to automatically scan documents and block them from being moved to unapproved locations. So that's another piece of this as well, and or turn on encryption. There's lots of options once you identify the sensitive data. In terms of what you can do with it. There's definitely technology out there that can help in those regards from an enforcement perspective, identifying and enforcing document sensitivity.
So the challenge with some of these things is that you've got web browsers that remember your passwords for you, and you get lazy, right?
Yeah.
I won't name which vendors' browsers are used for that type of thing, but they're quite they're highly used, and so you can become complacent and depend on those types of features, when in reality you're looking to compromise your security, either your security or the security of the organization.
I'm going to jump in and point out there's also things like Have I Been Pwned has an API. So you can actually run an API through it and find out if your employees are getting hit, if their information is being posted there. So there are things you can do like that too that will bring some intelligence to the work you're trying to do in preventing employees from clicking on that bad link and giving away their passwords in the first place. There's also things like DMARC and recursive DNS. And so I'm putting links in the chat again to help prevent those employees from doing something that's going to compromise data before they even compromise it.
Yeah, that's one of the things we actually search for. So if you're signed up for Azure Active Directory, one of the but it's Bing that does this actually, is Bing crawls the dark web to see for all the websites that sell credentials to see if your employees' credentials are on that list. And then that creates an additional risk factor the next time that user tries to log in. And in most organizations, the forcing function will be to reset their password immediately before they're allowed to go any further.
And several password managers in other companies do that as well.
Yep.
I also think there's just some really basic things to do. Like, don't give your employees a URL that they're supposed to type in. You can provide them a link, a button on a tile on the desktop, or a shortcut pushed out by policy, so that users are accessing applications from links. When we set up the Active Directory single sign-on with our application, we encourage users to use what they call the enterprise registration. So our application appears as a tile in the Office 365 or Microsoft 365 setup, like alongside other applications that we've got access to. And so you're less likely, one easy way, pretty easy way that you could get attacked is simply somebody stands up a misspoken, a misspelt version of a URL that you're using internally with a mirror site for your employees to log into. The site doesn't even have to work. All it has to have is a reproduction of your login page, and they can start capturing those credentials. So by just avoiding that practice, by providing people proper links to access the application, you can to some extent protect yourself from that.
Mm-hmm. The barrier of entry, by the way, to doing exactly what Paul just described, which is spoofing a website, there are free tools out there, Kali Linux being one of them, that where it's a menu driven, like, okay, today I want to spoof a website and capture some credentials, right? It's not like the movies where people are banging on keyboards. It's like ordering a sub at Jimmy John's. It's that the barrier of entry technologically and financially is so low, right? And then they actually, even after you type in your credentials, it actually flips you over to the real site that it was spoofing. So you think you fat fingered it, you get into the normal site, no alarm bells go off at the user. It's quite ingenious.
So we have dove into some pretty significant detail about different tools and activities and technologies that we can apply here. And Kevin hits us with a question that kind of takes us back up. It's a bit at 90 degrees from the technology perspective that we've had here. And it really is, he talks about since public trust and confidence in the courts is critical to our ability to serve, and parties are submitting some personal data to them, how do we effectively translate all these efforts that we've gone to describe to them that, yes, indeed, their data is managed safely? What are some of the translating some of the things that we're putting in place and why it matters to them, or why it enables them to be able to trust that the courts will keep their data safe and secure? Any insights or suggestions about how to bring this to a level that say an elected clerk can explain to their constituents in a time it takes to order an ice cream cone at the county fair?
Could I just start by saying, when you move to digitalization, you inevitably introduce new risks, but you also remove some of the risks that you have in your existing process. I think with a lot of this, there's a baseline. The current process is perfect. It's completely secure. It's all on paper. And this new digital process is going to introduce all these new risks. And yeah, there is some truth to that, but you've also removed a number of risks. If you think about the way an IT system works, and it won't just be ours, I'm sure it's all of the court evidence management systems. Every single action performed in that system is audited and can be replayed. It's the equivalent of the security camera above the cash register on everything that's happening with the material. You don't have that kind of coverage with paper-based processes. My first thing would be to say, look, the things we're addressing about some of the cyber risks, I won't sort of go over again because we've been talking about them in these sessions about how we protect ourselves, the things that we do as suppliers to try and protect ourselves and therefore our customers from these risks, because it would be effectively the end of our business if there was some kind of major breach. But I also think the discussion needs to come in to look at the improvements that this brings, and not just the new threats or the new risks that it might introduce.
Mm-hmm. Other perspectives on this? Insights on how these changes impact positively for our folks that we serve?
I think if you're able to communicate to someone who's not in IT or not in courts, the average citizen, the importance of compliance to specific standards, if you can make that valuable or help them understand the value of that, and then you can communicate that you comply with those standards, that's one way to sort of first try to engender trust. That's just what jumps to mind for me.
Yeah, so looking at, go ahead.
My apologies, Joe. I was gonna say, just building on what Dean said, I tend to compare it to things like I'm doing the cyber equivalent of having that Better Business Bureau sticker on my front door, or the health inspection grade on my door to the restaurant. There are known standards just like that are for cyber specific. So I'm doing the equivalent.
Gotcha. Very good. Well, that gives us some perspective on those things. I'm looking for other comments that have come through. Jason from IBM talked about some of the benefits of zero trust and the capabilities that it has there in terms of the dealing with breaches and those types of things. So I just want to, we're coming up to the end of our session here, and I'm not sure that given how this panel dives into topics and goes into details on stuff that we can make it all the way through before we get to the end of our day, especially for our friends on the East Coast. So unless we've got a comment from the crowd, I might wrap here. Once again, these sessions are, they tend to be sparked conversations about stuff that we deeply care about here as we try to solve things. These sessions are recorded. They're going to be available on the website at IJIS.org. And one of the things I want to do is invite folks to go to IJIS.org, look at involvement there. IJIS is an organization for both industry folks and for folks from government, so you can find a membership that fits you. And also invite you to the mid-year briefing and member forum in Orlando, starting August 30th through September 1st. I want to thank everybody that has been involved here today, Dean and Paul and Jason and Stacy, and everybody on the call that has been contributing to our conversation here today. It's really been handy and great. It gives us an opportunity to dive into some of the issues that we face here and to a level of detail that webinars don't really give you a chance. And with all that, I want to thank you all and appreciate all the time you've invested with us today. Take good care.
Thank you.